Imagine the soft crackle of a fire beneath a cabin roof, the scent of pine and fresh earth drifting through the air, and the distant hush of forests under a twilight sky. You can almost hear the quiet rhythm of hands shaping wood and stone, each motion deliberate, each wall a story waiting to be told. Tonight, we'll wander gently back in time, exploring the hidden details of how pioneers carved homes from wilderness, using little more than their strength, ingenuity and patience. Did you know that some cabins stood for decades without a single nail, held together entirely by clever joinery and hope? And there are small, surprising ways they worked with nature itself to build shelters that could endure wind, rain and snow. So settle in, let your mind drift along the trails they once walked, and perhaps, if it feels right, leave a soft like, comment, or subscribe to keep these quiet journeys alive. I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now, as we begin this peaceful journey through history. Long before machines shaped our world, before iron tools and sawmills sang their metallic songs, people learned to build with what surrounded them. The early pioneers who crossed vast wildernesses in search of land and freedom carried very little, a few supplies, their faith, and the knowledge passed down through generations. They found themselves in forests that stretched endlessly, rivers that shone like glass under the sun, and soil that promised both shelter and struggle. In those early years of settlement, survival depended not on technology, but on understanding nature itself. When settlers arrived in the unclaimed lands of the frontier, there were no roads, no lumberyards, and certainly no ready-made homes. What they found was a world of raw materials, trees that could be shaped, soil that could be moulded, and rivers that carried both life and danger. Every home began as an observation. How strong is this wood? How thick is this clay? How can the earth itself keep out the wind? The forest was their first teacher. They learned that pine was easy to cut but not as strong as the oak. Cedar kept away insects, while birch could be stripped for bark to cover the roof. Each tree had its own temperament, and the pioneers treated them almost like neighbours, some friendly, some stubborn, some useful only in the coldest nights as firewood. The process began with clearing, not with axes of steel, but often with sharpened stones tied to wooden handles. They would mark trees by hand, burn their bases, and slowly guide them down. Every fallen trunk was not just timber, it was progress, a wall, a floor, perhaps even a future cradle. The logs were dragged by rope, rolled over stones, and stacked into rough frames, sometimes using mud or wet soil to fill the gaps. Mud, or daub as they called it, became their mortar. It was mixed with grass, straw, and water until it felt like heavy clay. Children stomped on it barefoot while their parents pressed it into the spaces between logs. When the sun baked it dry, it hardened like stone. In winter, when snow gathered at the edges of the cabin, that same clay kept the cold from seeping in. Soil wasn't just a material, it was a shield. Pioneers often built half-dug shelters called soddies, homes carved partly into hillsides, using the earth as both wall and insulation. In places like the Great Plains, where trees were scarce, settlers cut blocks of grass-covered soil and stacked them like bricks. These sod houses were dark, damp, and sometimes home to insects, but they were warm, silent, and surprisingly strong against the wind. Nature, though harsh, provided everything: protection, materials, even lessons in patience. Water, too, played its role. They used it to soften bark, to mix soil, to cool their hands after long hours of labour. Sometimes they built near streams not for beauty, but for survival, a constant reminder that every drop was as valuable as any tool. At night, when the moon reflected on the river and the fresh wood crackled in the hearth, a quiet pride filled the small smoky rooms. The home might not have been beautiful, but it was theirs, built from the very land they stood upon. The pioneers didn't see nature as an obstacle, they saw it as a companion. Where others might have seen wilderness, they saw a partner willing to help, if only they worked with it, not against it. They learned to read the wind, to sense the soil's mood, to recognize which trees would fall safely and which would twist with danger. Each day taught them humility, that the land was generous, but only to those who respected it. Over time, their settlements grew. Cabins became villages, villages became towns, and yet the oldest structures, those made from simple wood and packed soil, often lasted the longest. They carried not just strength, but spirit. Each wall was a memory of effort, each roof a song of endurance. In the end, those who built without modern tools left behind more than homes. They left lessons. That progress begins not with machines, but with understanding. That comfort doesn't come from ease, but from balance, and that sometimes the greatest architect of all is the earth itself. By the time their homes stood tall enough to keep out the wind, the settlers' hands had become a map of their labour, lined, calloused, and permanently marked by the weight of the earth. Every splinter told a story, every scar remembered a day of survival. They had come seeking a better life, yet the land demanded everything from them first, their comfort, their softness, even their fear. Still, in the silence of those wide-open plains, their hearts found a peace that no city could offer. Work began at sunrise and often ended only when stars took the sky. Men cut wood while women hauled water, ground grain, and mended clothes torn by the day's chores. Children gathered kindling, fetched mud for the walls, and learned early that play came only after work. There were no breaks, no shortcuts, only the rhythm of need and endurance. And yet, beneath all that hardship, there was a strange kind of harmony. The pioneers learned that peace wasn't the absence of struggle, it was the acceptance of it. Each morning they faced the world not as victims but as partners in creation. When the sun rose, painting the sky in soft gold, the sound of axes and saws felt almost like music. The smell of fresh-cut wood mingled with smoke from the hearth, and even exhaustion carried a sense of meaning. They were not just building walls, they were building belonging. Inside those rough cabins the air smelled of earth, sweat, and cooking stew. Firelight flickered on wooden beams, and shadows danced like old spirits across the floor. After supper, when the winds howled outside, families would gather close around the hearth. There were no books, no instruments, just stories. Stories of the homes they had left behind, of journeys across endless trails, and of the promise that the future would be kinder to their children. In those moments, laughter echoed louder than the storm. Their hands might have been rough, but their hearts beat softly, steady as the crackling fire. They had learned to take pride not in perfection, but in perseverance. A crooked wall was still shelter. A patched roof still kept out the rain. Even the smallest success felt like a victory against the wilderness itself. Neighbours, often miles apart, became more than friends. They became lifelines. When one family's roof caved under snow, another arrived with wood and rope before morning. When someone fell ill, the entire settlement gathered herbs, boiled water, and prayed together. There was no wealth, no luxury, but there was abundance of something far rarer: trust. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, kindness became the only true currency. Peace for them wasn't quiet. It was earned. It came after hours of splitting logs, repairing fences, and chasing livestock in the rain. It came when they stood at the doorway at dusk, wiping sweat from their brows, and watched the light fade over their land. That silence, that golden stillness, was their reward. A reminder that even the hardest days ended in beauty. At night, while others slept, some would sit alone by the fire, mending tools or carving new handles. The flicker of flame showed the deep lines etched in their faces, marks not just of age but of purpose. They knew they would never live easy lives, but they also knew something profound, that peace does not need comfort to exist. It needs meaning, and meaning they had in abundance. In the years that followed, their hands grew older, but their hearts remained steady. The cabins they built began to weather, but the memories within stayed warm. Every scar, every callus became a quiet reminder of a truth the modern world often forgets: that strength and serenity can live in the same soul, that the roughest hands can build the gentlest lives, and so, as the wind whispered through the cracks and the stars hung like lanterns over the endless fields, the pioneers rested. Their bodies ached, but their spirits were still. Because even in a world made of struggle and stone, they had found something rare, a peace born not of ease, but of purpose. By the time the cabins began to settle into the earth, They looked as though they had always belonged there. The rough logs had darkened with smoke and rain, the roofs had sagged slightly under the weight of countless winters, and the mud packed between the beams had hardened into stone. Yet, to anyone who lived inside those humble walls, they were more than wood and clay. They were living memories. Every groove, every crack, every grain of timber carried the story of someone's will to survive. These walls had been raised by hands that refused to quit. Some were built by families who had crossed mountains and rivers just to find this patch of land. Others stood as the last refuge for people who had lost everything elsewhere. Each log carried the weight of those dreams, the dreams of shelter, safety, and the quiet dignity of starting again. When the wind howled outside, those walls answered back in creaks and sighs, the language of endurance. In the early mornings, when frost still clung to the windows and breath turned to mist, the first light would slip through the gaps in the wood. It painted the rough walls in shades of gold, revealing the marks of labour left long ago, the uneven strokes of an old axe, the burn scars from candles placed too close, the scratches of children's play. Every mark told a truth. This house was not built for beauty, it was built to last. And in that, it found a different kind of grace. The pioneers learned quickly that endurance was not just physical, it was spiritual. The storms would come without warning. Winds strong enough to rip a door from its hinges, rains that turned paths into rivers, and winters that buried entire valleys under white silence. When that happened, there was no one to call for help, only the shelter they had built with their own hands. And so they trusted their walls like old friends. They listened to them groan under the storm, and somehow that sound brought comfort. Because as long as the walls stood, hope still lived inside. Sometimes endurance meant adaptation. When wood rotted, they patched it with bark. When the roof leaked, they layered moss between the shingles. When the mud cracked, they pressed it smooth again with wet hands. No repair was perfect, yet every repair made the cabin stronger, more a part of its people, more a part of its land. In time, the walls became like mirrors of the lives within them, weathered, scarred, but unbroken. Endurance also lived in the small, quiet routines of their days, the way mothers smoothed the same wooden table each night before sleeping, the way fathers checked the beams for weakness, tapping the corners as if speaking to the house itself, the way children learned to seal gaps with clay, laughing as the wind whistled through. They didn't know it, but they were teaching themselves a lesson the world still struggles to learn, that strength doesn't come from avoiding hardship, but from living through it with patience. Visitors from newer towns often looked at those cabins and saw poverty, crude walls, uneven floors, smoke-stained ceilings. But those who lived inside saw legacy. They saw every day of labour, every moment of fear and gratitude pressed into the grain. They saw walls that had held laughter, grief, and the soft rhythm of life itself. Even the silence in those rooms had meaning. It was the sound of endurance. Years later, when the next generation began to build with saws and nails, some of those old cabins still stood firm. Their corners leaned a little, their roofs slumped, but their hearts, the thick, interlocked logs, remained strong. Travellers would stop and touch the walls, tracing the deep grooves where hands had worked more than a lifetime ago. And in that touch, they could feel something rare, the quiet persistence of human spirit. Because endurance, like those walls, never shouts. It whispers. It lives in the creak of wood that refuses to fall, in the warmth of a home built from nothing, and in the memory of those who believed that survival itself was worth every hardship. The pioneers may have passed, but the homes they left behind still breathe softly in the wild, reminders that even the simplest walls, when built with courage, can outlast the storms of time. Before there were hammers, before the first saw sang against the grain of wood, there was ingenuity, pure, patient, and born from necessity. When the pioneers and early settlers stepped into untouched lands, they found no blacksmiths, no iron, and no tools waiting for them. All they had were the gifts the earth itself offered, stone, bone, and willpower. And from those humble beginnings they crafted the means to build their world. The first tools were not perfect. They were ideas made solid. A sharp-edged rock became a blade. A deer's rib bone turned into a scraper. Pieces of flint struck at just the right angle could split wood or shape a branch into something useful. They didn't have blueprints or workshops. They had observation. They watched how stones fractured, how bones curved, how nature had already perfected its own designs. Flint was among their greatest discoveries. When struck carefully against another rock, it broke into pieces so sharp they could cut hide or shave bark. Men carried flint blades in their belts like prized possessions, wrapping them in leather to protect both tool and hand. With flint and patience, they learned to carve handles, fashion hooks, and even make primitive chisels for joining logs. Each new creation felt like a small victory, another step toward taming the wilderness. Bone, too, played its silent role in the story of survival. From the remains of hunted animals came needles, awls, and wedges. Every hunt gave not only food, but raw material, proof that even in death, nature continued to provide. A femur could be split to create a smooth-edged scraper. Antlers became handles, and the fine tips of bones made perfect stitching tools for hides and leather. In their hands, these fragments of life became the foundation of civilization. They also learned from the land's own teachers, the indigenous peoples who had mastered these techniques for generations before them. Native communities showed settlers how to chip stone efficiently, how to use sinew for binding, and how to heat rock to make it stronger. These were lessons paid for not in coin, but in humility. Many pioneers who survived their first winters did so because they listened, watched, and learned from those who had already shaped the land with wisdom and respect. Making tools from stone and bone required not only strength, but patience. It was work that demanded silence, the kind where even a single wrong strike could shatter hours of effort. At dusk, settlers sat outside their cabins tapping flint against stone, sparks flashing in the twilight like fireflies. The rhythm of their work echoed softly through the woods, the heartbeat of progress in its purest, simplest form. And though the tools were crude, they carried a sense of wonder. To shape a tree with something made from a river rock was to feel the connection between all things, the builder, the tool, the earth, and the life it sustained. When a cabin wall went up using tools made by hand, it wasn't just labour. It was collaboration with the land itself. They weren't conquering nature, they were learning its language. But there was hardship too. A stone axe dulled quickly, a bone chisel cracked in the cold. When that happened, they simply made another. Not out of frustration, but with quiet resolve. Each failure taught them more about material, pressure, and endurance. These early craftsmen didn't seek perfection, they sought survival, and that made every tool sacred. Over time, these crude inventions evolved. A handle bound with sinew made a grip stronger. A stone head set into wood became an early hammer. From bone and bark, they fashioned ropes. From stone, they birthed the first sparks of industry. The entire story of civilization, in a way, began with these quiet experiments beside campfires, where patience met purpose. When future generations found those ancient tools buried beneath the soil, they were often surprised by how simple they looked. But simplicity is deceptive. Each chip, each edge, was a symbol of creativity and survival, proof that the human mind needs little more than curiosity and persistence to shape a world. In the end, those first settlers didn't just build homes, they built hope. With stones as their hammers and bones as their chisels, they reminded the world of something timeless, that progress doesn't always roar. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, with two hands, and the courage to strike stone against stone in the fading light. The days stretched endlessly on the frontier. Each sunrise felt almost identical to the one before, the same mist clinging to the grass, the same wooden tools leaning against the cabin walls, the same quiet rhythm of survival. Time, for the pioneers, did not rush. It crept. Every task, from chopping a single log to grinding a handful of grain, demanded hours of focus. And yet, in that slow passage of time, their spirits grew stronger than iron. Morning came early, long before light touched the hills. The sound of a rooster, or sometimes just the ache in one's back, was enough to signal the start of another day. There were no clocks, no bells, no urgency beyond the needs of the land. Breakfast was often a small piece of bread, sometimes only broth or porridge, eaten in silence. Then came the work, the endless, necessary work. Men went to the forests where the air smelled of pine and dew. Their axes, often dull, sometimes just sharpened stones bound to sticks, bit slowly into the trees. Each swing echoed through the woods, marking time like the tick of a distant clock. A single tree might take hours to fall, and days more to cut into usable logs, but no one complained. They understood something many have forgotten, that lasting things are born not from speed but from patience. Women too fought their quiet battles against time. They sewed clothes from worn cloth, repaired tools, tended small gardens that struggled to grow in stony soil. Each task required steady hands and calm determination. When water froze in the bucket, they melted snow. When food ran low, they found roots and herbs hidden beneath the frost. Every small act became an expression of strength. Not loud, not celebrated, but enduring. The children learned by watching. They mimicked their parents, pretending to chop wood with sticks, or carrying pebbles as though they were stones for a wall. To them, the slow rhythm of life was normal, the passing of days marked not by clocks, but by chores and sunsets. They found joy where they could. A smooth stone, a bird's feather, a small stream that froze into glass at night. Even in hardship, childhood found a way to exist. Seasons changed like long chapters in a book. Spring was the season of mud and planting. Summer brought work from dawn to dusk. Autumn meant gathering and preparing. And winter was the test. Snow-sealed doors shut, winds rattled the cabins, and silence filled the air so deeply it could be felt in the bones. During those long, frozen months, families huddled close to the fire, telling stories to fill the space where time had stopped. It was in those moments that endurance turned into faith, faith that warmth and life would return again. There were no shortcuts in their world. To make one loaf of bread meant growing, harvesting, grinding, and baking by hand. To build one wall meant cutting, hauling, and fitting logs together without error. Every simple task demanded days, but the slowness was not their enemy, it was their teacher. It taught them humility. It taught them to listen, to the wind, to the soil, to their own heartbeat when exhaustion made the world blur. Sometimes, as twilight fell, they would step outside and look at the horizon, endless and untouched. There was beauty in that stillness. The air was cold, the light fading, and yet there was peace. Because though their bodies ached, their hearts carried a quiet certainty. They were doing something that mattered. Each day, however slow, built the foundation for generations yet to come. Time moved slowly, yes, but in that slowness they found meaning. They learned that progress isn't always visible. Sometimes it's hidden beneath the weight of daily repetition. Every sunrise that came too early, every night that ended too late, all of it was part of the silent story of strength. When historians look back, they often speak of inventions and wars, kings and revolutions. But the real strength of humanity was here, in these forgotten days, among people who worked quietly, without witnesses or applause. Their names may be lost, but their will endures. In every field cleared, every log home still standing, every seed that grew where once there was only wilderness. Because time may move slowly, but those who endure move mountains. By the time the cabins were complete, they stood quietly beneath the sky, not grand, not perfect, but proud. Each one was a monument, not to wealth or design, but to patience. They were built slowly by hands that had learned to wait, and by hearts that refused to give up. There was no blueprint, no rush. Every log, every beam, every handful of mud was placed with care and purpose, as if the builders knew that endurance itself was sacred. The pioneers understood that good things did not come quickly. A home wasn't something to be bought, it was something to be earned, one swing of the axe at a time. Many cabins took months to finish, not because they lacked skill, but because every step required nature's cooperation. The wood had to dry, the soil had to harden, and the weather had to show mercy. They waited for the right moment, watched the wind, studied the shadows, and learned from every small failure. And when the final log was set in place, it was more than construction. It was communion. In those early days, patience was the only tool sharper than any blade. A man could not fight the rain, nor could he rush the harvest. The land moved at its own pace, and those who survived were those who learned to match its rhythm. Each home became a record of that understanding. Some were rough and uneven, their roofs slanting to one side. Others were neat and sturdy, shaped by years of trial and error. But no matter how different they looked, they all shared the same soul, born from stillness, endurance, and trust in time. Inside, life was as simple as the structure itself. A single room often served as kitchen, bedroom, and workshop. The scent of wood smoke never truly left. It clung to clothes, to hair, to the air itself. When rain tapped softly against the roof, families would pause their work and listen, because even the storm's rhythm became part of their days. Their walls might have been rough, but they held peace. Every sound, the creak of the beams, the crackle of fire, the whisper of wind, reminded them of how far they had come. Those cabins aged like the people who built them. Sunlight bleached their roofs, frost split their corners, and vines crept slowly along the edges. But instead of decay, there was dignity. Every stain, every mark told a story of survival. When newcomers arrived, traders, wanderers, dreamers, they could see it immediately. These were not ordinary homes. They were testaments to human patience. They stood as proof that even without tools, comfort, or certainty, people could still build something that lasted. Patience was also visible in the way families cared for their homes. Each season demanded a new task: patching roofs before the rains, sealing gaps before the snows, repainting doors when the sun peeled away the colour. They didn't see it as maintenance. They saw it as gratitude. Because their homes were alive, breathing, changing, growing with them. To take care of it was to honour every moment that had gone into its making. At night, when candles flickered through the small, uneven windows, the cabins glowed softly against the dark. From a distance, the light looked almost sacred, like small stars scattered across the earth. And perhaps, in a way, they were. Each home was a quiet act of faith, a promise that even in the loneliest places warmth could exist. Generations later, when settlers moved on and new towns rose, many of those old cabins remained. Some crumbled, others stood empty, yet none were forgotten. Travellers who stumbled upon them could still feel something in the air, a kind of calm strength, the echo of those who built them with care instead of haste. Touching the walls, one could almost hear the heartbeat of time, slow, steady, unbroken. Because every home they built wasn't just made of wood and earth, it was made of waiting, of sunrises and sunsets, of days when nothing went right, and nights when the only comfort was knowing that tomorrow they would try again. Each home stood not only as shelter, but as a message, that patience, when joined with purpose, can outlast storms, seasons, even centuries. And so, long after the hands that built them turned to dust, those walls still whisper to the wind, that true creation takes time, that the strongest foundations are made not of stone, but of patience. When night fell across the wilderness, the forest became a world of shadows and silence. The trees stood like tall sentinels, their black outlines rising against the pale moonlight, and far within that darkness, small orange lights began to appear, the fires of the pioneers glowing deep within the forest. Those fires were more than warmth. They were survival itself. In a land where wild winds howled and frost could claim a man's life before dawn, fire meant hope. It meant safety from the cold, protection from predators, and the comfort of knowing that even in the heart of the wilderness, humanity could still shine. The pioneers guarded their fires like living treasures. Each spark was earned through patience and skill, struck from flint, nursed with dry moss, and fed gently with twigs until the flames rose steady and sure. At first, the art of fire-making was uncertain. The damp forest floor often swallowed their sparks, and rain could ruin a day's effort in seconds. But failure taught them resilience. They learned to shield their flames from the wind with cupped hands, to carry embers in hollowed bark when they moved from one place to another, and to store dry grass inside their coats to keep it safe from the weather. Every fire they lit became a silent victory against the untamed world around them. As the flames grew brighter, the forest began to change. What had once been a place of fear now became a kind of home. The orange light reflected off the trunks of the trees, turning them into glowing pillars that seemed to breathe with warmth. Smoke curled upward and disappeared into the stars. The air filled with the scent of pine resin and burning wood, the smell of life continuing despite the odds. The forest, once cold and endless, now had a heartbeat. Around these fires, people became families. Stories were told. Stories of the lands they had left behind, of the rivers they had crossed, of dreams they still carried. Children huddled close, eyes wide with wonder, as elders spoke softly of courage and faith. In those flickering circles of light, laughter returned. It was gentle, weary laughter, but it echoed beautifully against the trees. Even the forest seemed to listen. At night, the fires also served another purpose. They kept loneliness away. When one looked into the dark, the wilderness seemed infinite and unforgiving. But the fire, small as it was, reminded them that they were not alone. It was a companion, a steady friend in the quiet hours. When the flames danced, they carried memories of the first spark struck against stone, of the first meal cooked, of the first night survived. Every glowing ember was a reminder. They belonged here now. Sometimes the fires could be seen from miles away, tiny glimmers scattered among the trees like stars fallen to the earth. To travellers passing through the dark, those lights meant safety. They meant there were people nearby, hands that could help, voices that would answer. In a world without roads, fences or signs, firelight became a language of its own. It told others, "We are here, we have made it through the night." But fire was a teacher too, one that demanded respect. It could warm, but it could also destroy. Many learned the hard way that carelessness could turn safety into ruin. A single spark left untended could spread through dry leaves like a curse. So they learned balance, to tend the fire gently, to feed it only what it needed, and to thank it for its light before sleep. That balance between danger and comfort became the rhythm of pioneer life. In the stillness before dawn, when the flames burned low and the forest began to grey with the coming light, the fires would shrink to quiet coals. The people would stir, stretch their weary limbs, and watch the embers fade. There was beauty even in that, in the slow surrender of flame to ash, in the soft sigh of smoke rising into the morning air. Because they knew that later, when the sun fell again, they would bring the fire back to life, from spark to blaze, from fear to warmth. And so, night after night, those fires glowed deep within the forest, symbols of human will against the vast silence of nature. They did not burn to conquer, but to coexist. Each flame flickered with the same quiet truth that had carried them through every hardship, that even in the darkest places light can still endure, and that every small fire, no matter how humble, holds the heart of a home. Winter came early in those untamed lands. It did not arrive gently. It arrived like a wall of white silence, swallowing the forest, freezing the rivers, and testing the courage of every soul who dared to stay. The fires that once glowed so warmly now struggled against the storm, their light flickering weakly beneath the weight of falling snow. The pioneers had built their homes from patience and faith. Now nature would see if those walls could endure. The first snow always brought a strange calm. It covered the rough ground in a blanket of beauty, soft and pure, hiding the struggles beneath it. But beauty turned to battle when the drifts grew deeper and the winds began to howl. The roofs groaned under layers of ice. Smoke from the chimneys twisted wildly before disappearing into the storm. Men worked through the cold with numb hands, patching leaks with frozen mud, tightening logs that had shrunk from frost. Inside, families huddled close, listening to the storm's voice, a low, endless roar that seemed to test their every breath. Rain followed the snow, turning paths into rivers of ice and mud. The forest, once full of colour, now stood bare and black, its branches bent and dripping. When the rain came, it found every weakness, every crack in the walls, every gap in the roof, every fault in their effort. Buckets were placed beneath leaks, furs hung near the fire to dry, and blankets were doubled to keep out the chill. There was no comfort except the steady heartbeat of endurance. The pioneers learned that survival was not one great act of strength. It was 1,000 small victories against the elements. Then came the wind. It was not like the gentle breeze that whispered through the trees in summer. It was a force that screamed across the plains and tore at everything in its path. The wind clawed at doors, rattled shutters, and carried the sound of distant trees breaking under its weight. It would sweep across the roofs at night, whistling like a ghost through the cracks. Children would wake in fear, but parents would hold them close, whispering, "It's only the wind. It will pass." And somehow, it always did. They learned to move with the seasons, to bend instead of break. When snow blocked their doors, they dug tunnels through it. When rain flooded their paths, they built wooden walkways. When the wind tore down what they had made, they rebuilt, slower, wiser, stronger. The forest taught them resilience, not through ease, but through repetition. Each storm became a teacher, each hardship a lesson, and slowly they began to understand that the wilderness was not their enemy. It was their proving ground. Inside those cabins, the war against the weather turned into something almost sacred. The fire burned low but steady. Meals were smaller but shared with care. They sang softly to fill the silence and told stories to push back the fear. Every creak of the logs, every gust of wind outside reminded them of one simple truth. They were still here, still breathing, still standing, still unbroken. And that was victory enough. By spring, when the snow finally began to melt, the cabins looked battered but proud. The walls bore the scars of winter, water stains, split wood, and patches of moss where rain had seeped through. Yet beneath all that they stood firm. The pioneers stepped outside, faces pale and tired, and watched the forest come alive again. Rivers rushing, trees budding, sunlight warming the earth once more. Their clothes were worn, their hands rough, but their spirits burned like the fires they had kept alive all season. They had learned that the world could be cruel, but it could also be kind. It was both destroyer and giver, both test and reward. And through it all, they found a strange peace in knowing that no storm, not snow, not rain, not relentless wind, could truly defeat them. For as long as they could build, light a fire, and stand together, they would endure. And so, when the next winter came, as it always did, they did not fear it. They simply prepared. They gathered wood, sealed their walls, and waited for the first snowflake to fall. Because they now understood what the wilderness had been teaching them all along, that strength is not found in comfort, but in the courage to face the storm again and again, and still believe in spring, when the long winter finally released its hold. The land awoke again, slow, green, and full of promise. The snow melted into the earth, feeding the roots of young grass and filling the rivers that had slept beneath the ice. And within the cabins, life began to stir once more. The fires burned brighter, the air smelled of wet soil, and laughter returned to places that had known only silence. The homes still stood, weathered, imperfect, and beautiful, each one resting on floors of dirt, beneath dreams as wide as the sky. Those floors told stories. They were uneven, packed tight by footsteps and time. Every mark, every scuff was a memory. The prints of boots returning from long hunts, the soft trail of children's bare feet, the indent where a chair had stood through countless meals. There were no tiles, no polished wood, only the honest earth beneath their feet. Yet no one complained. They knew that beneath that soil lay everything that kept them alive, their roots, their labour, their belonging. It was as if the land itself was part of the home, holding them in quiet partnership. When sunlight streamed through the small windows, it touched the dirt floor with warmth, and the air filled with specks of golden dust. To the pioneers, that dust was not a sign of poverty. It was proof of life. It meant they were still building, still growing, still creating something from nothing. Children would trace shapes in the floor with sticks. Mothers would sweep it smooth with bundles of dry grass, and fathers would kneel there each night to mend tools by firelight. The floor was rough, but it was sacred, the foundation of dreams still unfolding. Outside, those dreams stretched far beyond the walls. Every morning began with the same ritual, stepping out into a world that had no boundaries. The sky was endless, rolling over mountains and valleys like an ocean of light. Each sunrise carried new hope, for better harvests, for stronger homes, for futures they might never see but still believed in. Their world was wide, uncertain, and full of struggle, but it belonged to them. And that freedom, fragile as it was, made every hardship worthwhile. They built their days like they built their homes, one piece at a time. Each sunrise meant labour, cutting timber, mending fences, planting seeds. Each sunset meant reflection, a meal shared, a story told, a moment of peace before sleep. There was no luxury, no rest from work, but there was purpose in every motion. Because they weren't just surviving, They were shaping a world that had never existed before, a world built from faith in tomorrow. Visitors who came through the frontier often marvelled at how simple these cabins were. They saw bare floors, handmade tools and rough-hewn furniture, and wondered how anyone could live this way. But the settlers would smile softly. To them, those things were not signs of lack. They were signs of achievement. Every board nailed, every wall raised, every meal cooked over the fire was a triumph. Their homes were small, yes, but their dreams were vast. Too vast to be measured by comfort or wealth. At night, when the chores were done, they would step outside and look up. The stars were their ceiling, the wind their lullaby. Some nights were clear and filled with silver light. Others were dark and quiet, the world asleep under clouds. But every night they felt the same truth, that though their homes were humble, their lives were not. They were part of something larger, a living story written in sweat, soil and starlight. In time, the dirt floors would be replaced by planks, by rugs, by stone, and the cabins would become houses, towns, even cities. But those who came later would never know the full measure of what stood beneath their feet. The patience, the labour, the quiet hope that built the first homes on this wild land. Because long before comfort, before progress, before modern tools and roads, there were people who looked at the horizon and saw possibility, not emptiness. People who knelt on dirt floors with calloused hands and dreamed of futures brighter than the sky above them. And that, more than any wall or roof, was the real foundation they built upon, the unshakable belief that even the humblest home, when born from courage and faith, can hold a dream wide enough to touch the heavens. Before the cabins, before the fences, before the faintest trail of smoke rose from the chimneys, there was only emptiness. The land stretched endlessly. Vast plains, silent forests, rivers cutting through the wild like veins of silver. And into that emptiness came people with almost nothing. No wealth, no machines, no promise of comfort, only the strength in their hands and the stubborn will in their hearts. They arrived carrying bundles tied with a rope, tools worn thin from miles of travel, and faith that something better waited ahead. Their hands were blistered, their clothes torn, yet their eyes held a quiet fire. They knew they could not outmatch the wilderness with force, only with perseverance. Every tree they felled, every field they cleared, every log they lifted was an act of defiance against despair. They built, not because it was easy, but because they refused to stop. The first days were the hardest. They faced the raw earth with no ploughs, no iron nails, not even a steady roof over their heads. Rain soaked them to the bone, and nights brought the chill of fear. Wild animals circled the campfires, and the sounds of the forest seemed both alive and endless. Yet each dawn found them still standing. They rose with sore muscles and swollen fingers, ready to work again, proof that courage could grow even in exhaustion. They learned to use what they had. A broken branch became a hammer, a sharp stone became a blade, a fallen tree became both shelter and warmth. Necessity turned into creativity, a lesson the wilderness taught with brutal kindness. Every success, no matter how small, was celebrated. The first wall that didn't collapse in the wind, the first spark that caught in the rain, the first night they slept without fear. Their progress was slow, but their determination was faster than any storm. Sometimes they had to start over, a roof blown off in the night, a river flooding their crops, a wildfire undoing months of work. But giving up was never an option. They would stand in the ruins of their labour, shoulders heavy with fatigue, and begin again. Because the wilderness had no mercy for the weak-hearted, and no choice for the brave but to endure. They were not just building homes, they were building proof that humanity could root itself even in the harshest soil. In the evenings, when the sky turned deep gold and the air smelled of pine and smoke, they would sit beside their fires, hands resting on their knees. Those hands were cracked, scarred, stained with sap and soil, yet they told a story of triumph. Every scar was a signature of survival. Every callus was a testament to hope. They looked at their rough palms and knew these were not empty hands anymore. They were hands that shaped the earth itself. They shared food when there was little to share. They helped neighbours raise walls when storms tore them down. If one fell ill, others worked double. Their strength was not just in muscle, but in unity. a quiet bond forged through hardship. The wilderness demanded everything from them, but in return it gave something greater, a sense of purpose that no comfort could replace. Years later, when the next generation grew up surrounded by tools and smoother roads, the elders would tell stories of those first days, of when their hands were empty and their hearts were all they had. The younger ones would listen wide-eyed, trying to imagine such struggle, such simplicity. And though the old cabins would one day crumble, their spirit would remain, in every bridge, every farm, every town that rose from that same soil. Because the truth is timeless. It is not tools or wealth that build civilizations. It is will. The will to wake after failure. The will to believe when nothing is certain. The will to see the promise hidden within hardship. Those pioneers may have begun with nothing but calloused hands and stubborn dreams, but from that nothing, they built everything. A legacy carved not from comfort, but from courage. By the time the settlers had learned the rhythm of the land, they began to look at the forest differently. At first it had seemed endless, dark, towering and wild. The trees stood like guardians of a world untouched, their branches whispering in languages older than memory. But slowly, the pioneers realized something profound. The forest was not their enemy. It was their greatest ally. Every tree trunk that once blocked their path now stood as a pillar of hope. With nothing but axes of stone and bone, they worked from dawn to dusk, felling trees one by one. The sound of each strike echoed through the valleys, sharp, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. It was the sound of progress, of determination meeting resistance. They did not cut the trees in anger, but with reverence, knowing that every fallen trunk meant warmth in winter, shelter from storms, and a step closer to belonging. Each log carried a story. Some were dragged miles through mud and snow, their weight shared among neighbours. Others were lifted by ropes twisted from bark, shoulders straining beneath the burden. And when they reached the clearing where the new cabin would rise, the logs were laid carefully, one atop another, as if building an altar to endurance itself. The air would fill with the scent of pine and sweat, a blend of life and labour that became the fragrance of hope. The first walls always went up unevenly. Logs didn't fit perfectly, gaps appeared, corners leaned. But to them, perfection didn't matter. What mattered was that it stood, and when it did, when that first small frame took shape against the wild horizon, there was a quiet sense of triumph that words could never capture. Men would stand back, wiping their brows, while women and children watched in awe, eyes shining with pride. For the first time, the wilderness felt less endless, less overpowering. They were no longer guests in the forest, they were becoming part of it. Building with trees was more than survival. It was transformation. Each trunk they shaped turned chaos into structure, fear into faith. Even the stumps left behind became symbols, reminders of sacrifice and growth. They would often carve their initials into those stumps, small marks left in gratitude to the earth that sustained them. To the pioneers, every beam raised wasn't just wood. It was a promise that this place, once empty and unknown, would one day hold families, laughter, and the rhythm of human life. When the roofs were finally placed, the cabins looked humble against the vastness of the sky, yet powerful in their meaning. Smoke began to curl gently from chimneys, drifting upward through the same trees that had once stood untouched. It was as if the forest itself was breathing with them, giving and receiving, growing and renewing. The settlers began to plant new saplings near their homes, a quiet gesture of respect for what they had taken. In their minds, every young tree was the future, shelter for the next generation. At night, when the wind moved through the branches, the sound was familiar, soft, steady, reassuring. It carried with it the memory of labour and the echo of countless axe blows now long gone. The pioneers would listen from inside their cabins, wrapped in furs, the warmth of firelight flickering across the wooden walls. They could feel the forest around them, no longer a threat but a living friend, one that had tested them, shaped them, and finally accepted them. Years later, when travellers passed through those lands, they would see entire valleys of log homes standing proud and weathered. Many of the first builders had passed on, but their cabins still held strong, their wooden beams darkened with age yet unbroken. The travellers would touch the walls, feel the rough bark beneath their fingers, and understand. These were not mere buildings. They were monuments to courage, carved from the living bones of the earth. Because to those who came with nothing, a single tree meant everything. It meant fire in winter, food from the forest, tools, shelter, and the dream of a future no storm could erase. And so, as the pioneers worked, they did not see themselves as conquerors of the land, but as partners in its endless cycle of giving and growing. Every tree they felled carried a piece of their story, and every home they raised whispered the same quiet truth. That hope, when rooted deep and tended with care, can grow stronger than even the tallest forest. By the time the first cabins stood firm against the wind, the wilderness had begun to soften, not because it had changed, but because the people had. The pioneers no longer feared every sound that echoed from the forest, or every shadow cast by the mountains. They had built something solid, something that wouldn't vanish with the next storm. Their homes, though, small and rough, stood like anchors in a sea of untamed nature. And yet, as they worked on these humble wooden shelters, what they were really building went far beyond walls and roofs. These were not just houses, they were futures taking shape. Each log laid down was more than a beam of wood. It was a declaration that life would continue here. The settlers could already imagine the seasons passing, children laughing outside in the summer sun, smoke rising gently in the fall, fires crackling while snow drifted outside their tiny windows. Every nail, every joint, every stone in the hearth was a promise to tomorrow. For people who had left everything behind, comfort, familiarity, even safety, this small corner of earth was becoming the centre of their world. Inside those cabins, life began to bloom in small but beautiful ways. Women lined the walls with animal hides to block the cold. Men built crude tables and benches from leftover logs. Over time, the smell of fresh bread began to mingle with the scent of pine and wood smoke. A single candle flickering on a rough-hewn shelf could make the entire room feel alive. It was no palace, but it was home. And that word, home, carried more meaning here than in any grand city. In these early settlements, every family's success depended on another's. Neighbours helped raise roofs together, shared food during harsh winters, and took turns watching over one another's livestock. Their communities were not built with bricks or laws, but with shared endurance. When one cabin rose, it gave courage to the next. When one hearth burned bright, it warmed the hearts of many. Through those first winters, that unity became their greatest tool of survival. Children grew up watching the forest turn into villages, villages into towns. They learned how to carve, how to mend, how to listen to the language of the wind. The same trees their parents had cut now shaded their paths to nearby streams. Each new generation looked at the sturdy cabins not as relics of the past, but as proof that dreams could take root in even the hardest soil. To them, the forest was not a wilderness anymore. It was home ground, sacred and strong. The pioneers didn't know it at the time, but what they were doing would shape the story of an entire land. Their cabins became symbols of determination and faith, not just for their families, but for everyone who would come after. A single house in the wilderness became the first mark of civilization, the first sign that people could coexist with the raw power of nature. The smoke from their chimneys rose into the sky like a signal, a message saying, "We are still here. We endure." Many years later, when those same cabins had aged and the logs turned dark with rain and time, travellers would still find warmth in them. Some would stop to rest by the same fires. Others would rebuild them using new tools and new dreams. The cycle continued. Old, wood making way for new hands, new hopes. And in this endless rebuilding, the spirit of the pioneers lived on. Because the truth was simple. They hadn't just built shelters against the cold. They had built beginnings. They hadn't just survived. They had created the foundation of something enduring. Their homes were blueprints of courage, drawn not on parchment, but on earth itself. They stood as monuments to ordinary people with extraordinary will, men and women who turned fear into faith and wilderness into a world. And as the generations that followed looked upon those old cabins, still standing among trees that had once been cut to build them, they saw more than history. They saw the quiet miracle of human persistence, proof that from the simplest materials, guided by nothing but hope, entire futures can take shape. The settlers had built their cabins, but their journey was far from over. Each day brought new battles, not against enemies, but against the limits of what their hands could endure. In an age before steel nails, iron ploughs, or forged blades, every task demanded creativity and grit. They had no iron, yet their resolve was iron strong. Where others saw hardship, the pioneers saw possibility. When their wooden axes splintered, they carved new handles and shaped stone edges sharper than before. When the rope frayed, they twisted bark fibres until they held like iron chains. Even the smallest invention, a bone-tipped spear, a wooden peg, was the result of countless attempts, endless patience, and an unbreakable will. They worked with what nature offered. Tree sap became glue, animal sinew became thread, river stones became tools. Every discovery came with scars, hands calloused, fingers torn, arms lined with scratches. But those marks were badges of survival, quiet proof that humanity could bend, adapt, and still rise. They did not possess iron in their hands, but it burned within their spirit. Each task, no matter how simple, carried weight. When they built fences to guard their crops, they drove stakes into the frozen earth with nothing but stone mallets. When they dug wells, they carved through layers of rock and clay using nothing more than persistence and raw strength. It was slow work, exhausting, endless, but every inch gained felt like victory over impossibility itself. And through that labour, they learned something extraordinary. The real tools were not made of metal, but of willpower, cooperation, and faith. The nights were the hardest. When tools broke, when food ran low, when cold crept through every crack in the walls, doubt whispered in the silence. But someone would always stand, take a breath, and begin again. A man would return to the forest to search for the right kind of wood. A woman would mend what others had deemed beyond repair. Their belief was simple. If the earth had provided once, it would provide again. And somehow it always did. Generations later, historians would marvel at how these people managed without iron. But to the pioneers, it wasn't a miracle. It was necessity. When there's no other choice but to endure, even the weakest hand becomes strong. Their ingenuity foreshadowed the inventiveness that would one day forge nations. The first wooden ploughs would later give birth to steel ones. The crude stone chisels would inspire blacksmiths to craft sharper, stronger tools. Everything that came after, every bridge, city, and invention, carried traces of those early struggles. Even now, when archaeologists uncover the remains of those wooden cabins, they find not just structures, but symbols. Hand-cut beams, perfectly balanced without a single nail, joints locked together through pure precision. Each design tells a story of adaptation, of how humans, even stripped of metal and machines, can still master their surroundings with patience and imagination. To them, iron was not something mined from the ground. It was something mined from within. It was in the father teaching his son how to split wood without shattering it. It was in the mother stitching hides to keep her children warm through the bitter wind. It was in every shared glance that said, "We will not give up." When storms came, tearing roofs and flooding fields, they rebuilt. When crops failed, they tried again the next season. And when their tools broke in half, they didn't curse their fate. They carved another, stronger than before. The land tested them, shaped them, and through that trial gave them a strength that no iron could rival. So, when people later spoke of the Iron Age, the age of blades and machines, they forgot that an age of the spirit had come long before, an age when courage and endurance were the only metals that mattered, because long before they held iron in their hands, they had already forged it in their hearts. When the first pieces of iron finally reached the settlers' hands, they did not take them for granted. A handful of nails, a single hammerhead, or a small saw was worth more than gold. Each nail carried a tale of struggle, of journeys through wilderness, of barter and trade, of risk and patience. For years they had built without them. They had shaped homes with wooden pegs, locked beams together with notches, and bound walls using nothing but faith and muscle. But the day metal entered their world, everything changed. Not because the work became easier, but because those small bits of iron carried the memory of every hardship endured before them. Some nails came from faraway traders who crossed rivers and forests just to deliver a few pounds of precious metal. Others were salvaged from broken wagons or melted down from old traps and pots. Nothing was wasted. Every spark that flew from the blacksmith's fire was watched like a miracle. Children would stand wide-eyed as the iron glowed red, their faces lit by the flickering flame, knowing that each nail forged meant one more cabin strengthened, one more roof secured against the wind. The settlers treated these nails almost sacredly. Before hammering one in, they would measure twice, think thrice. If a nail bent, they straightened it. If one was lost, they searched the dirt until it was found. Every strike of the hammer echoed with gratitude, a sound that said, "We have come this far. We have earned this." Even the process of making nails was a story in itself. Blacksmiths worked with crude forges, built from stones and mud. Their bellows were made from animal hides, their hammers from rock tied to wooden shafts. And yet, in that raw simplicity, they created art. The iron hissed as it met the anvil, a rhythm like a heartbeat. Those who listened said it sounded like hope being shaped, one spark, one strike at a time. But beyond their practical use, the nails came to represent something deeper, the connection between people. Neighbours traded nails for flour, iron scraps for wool, and a few forged pieces could mean the difference between shelter and ruin. Entire communities would gather to help one another finish a cabin before the first snow. The nails they shared were not just tools, they were tokens of trust. To give one away meant giving away hours of labour, a piece of your own survival. It was generosity born from shared struggle. Inside those log cabins, you could feel the story of each nail in the air. When storms battered the walls and the wind screamed outside, the settlers listened to the creaks and groans of wood and iron holding fast. They knew that every sound told them something, of strength, of endurance, of how far human hands could go when guided by necessity and hope. Each nail, each beam, each stone was a verse in a larger song. The song of becoming, of belonging. Years later, when newer generations rebuilt the old cabins, they would find those same nails still embedded deep within the wood. Rust had crept over them, but they hadn't broken. Many of those nails were removed and kept as heirlooms, passed down from fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, reminders that even the smallest things can carry the weight of history. And when they held those nails in their palms, cold and rough, they could almost feel the heartbeat of their ancestors, the exhaustion, the determination, the quiet pride that built a world from wilderness. They didn't see a piece of metal. They saw survival, sacrifice, and love. Because in truth, every nail driven into those cabins was more than a fastener. It was a memory sealed in wood, a silent testament that said, "We were here, we worked, we endured." And though time would weather the walls and darken the beams, the spirit of those who built them would remain, strong, unbent, and shining faintly beneath the rust. By the time the walls stood firm and the chimneys smoked steadily, something miraculous had begun to unfold. What had once been chaos, wood, mud, stone, sweat, was becoming order. Every cut of the axe, every strike of the hammer, every handful of soil placed with care carried meaning. Slowly, dreams took form through human touch. The cabins, once rough shelters, started to feel alive. Each room echoed with the sounds of life. A baby's cry, the scrape of a wooden spoon, the quiet hum of evening prayers. Hands that once trembled from cold now stitched, carved, and built with purpose. They were no longer just surviving, they were creating. Every plank sanded, every window framed, every hearth lit was an act of quiet defiance against the wilderness that had once threatened to consume them. They began to carve patterns into beams, shaping the wood not just for use, but for beauty. A small flower etched into a doorway, a child's name, burned gently into a window frame, tiny marks of tenderness left on rough timber. Those touches were not decoration, they were signatures of belonging. In a world built from struggle, beauty itself became an act of courage. The pioneers knew that nothing they made would last forever. The storms would come, the wood would rot, and generations would pass. But still, they built with care, as if every wall might stand for eternity. Because they understood something profound. A dream, once shaped by human hands, carries the warmth of its maker long after the maker is gone. In the evenings, when the day's labour ended, families would gather outside their homes. The light of the fire danced across their faces, flickering against the wooden walls they had raised with their own strength. Someone would hum a tune, another would tell stories of the old country, of rivers far away, of the cities they left behind, and in those moments, surrounded by the vast silence of the wilderness, they realised how far they had come. The wilderness had not broken them. It had refined them. Children grew up watching their parents build not just homes, but habits of endurance. A mother teaching her daughter how to weave grass into mats, a father showing his son how to patch a roof with bark. Every gesture passed down a skill, a lesson, a dream. Their hands, worn and scarred, became teachers, proof that the world could be shaped by those who refused to yield. And though their tools were few, their imagination was endless. A hollowed-out tree became a cradle. A deer bone became a button. A stretch of hide turned into a window covering to keep the cold away. They did not wait for comfort to find them. They created it. Every object in their home was a story of transformation, of turning what was into what could be. The settlers began to plant gardens beside their cabins, scattering seeds brought from their old lands. They watched them grow through the seasons, tenderly watering them, protecting them from frost and animals. Those small green shoots meant more than food. They meant faith. Faith that their lives were not temporary, that they had truly begun something lasting. And as the first flowers bloomed beside their rough wooden homes, the land no longer felt like a stranger. It was theirs now, shaped, softened, and blessed by human hands. Decades later, when the next generation built larger homes with saws and nails and metal tools, they would still remember the first ones. Those early cabins, humble and hand-built, were the roots of everything that followed. And though the world would grow faster, louder, more modern, one truth would remain untouched. Dreams are not born from ease. They are shaped by touch, by hands that cut, carved, and crafted not out of wealth, but out of will. Hands that bled, but never stopped creating. Because long before progress came in steel and smoke, the first miracle was simple, a dream, formed slowly, patiently through the warmth of human touch. The forest stretched endlessly, its trunks rising like silent sentinels into the sky. To those who first settled here, the land could feel vast and empty, each shadow a reminder of their isolation. Among trees stood loneliness and hope, intertwined like the branches above. The wilderness was indifferent, but the pioneers were not defeated. They were learning that to survive, and to build a future, one had to carry both solitude and faith in equal measure. Days were long, and hours stretched into one another. A single cabin could feel unbearably small when surrounded by thousands of acres of forest. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, carrying the cries of distant animals and the whisper of far-off rivers. At times the pioneers felt utterly alone, yet within that loneliness was clarity, a chance to see their work, their families and their dreams with startling focus. It was in that quiet that they discovered the deepest strengths of their hearts. Hope was fragile but persistent. A child's laugh echoing across the clearing, the first sprout of green beside the cabin, a fire lit against the evening chill. These small signs reminded them that life endured. Every effort, from planting crops to building walls, was a gesture of faith. Even the smallest success, a roof that did not leak, a fire that did not die, became a victory over the solitude pressing in from all sides. They often walked among the trees alone, axes over shoulders surveying their land. Each step was a meditation. Each swing of the axe shaped not just wood, but character. They carved paths through dense brush, felled trees for timber, and built shelters from the raw earth itself. Every tree they touched became a monument to persistence, and every cleared space was a stage for future gatherings, for laughter, and for life. Despite the isolation, community still thrived in small ways. Neighbours would travel miles through dense forests just to help with a cabin roof or share a meal. Messages passed from one homestead to another on horseback or foot, small signs of solidarity in a world that often felt vast and merciless. Even the act of sharing a fire or a loaf of bread was a declaration. We are here. We endure. We will endure together. The nights were the hardest. Darkness in the forest was absolute, broken only by the occasional glow of a distant fire. Loneliness pressed in like the cold air seeping through the cracks of the cabin walls. But it was also a teacher. It demanded reflection, patience, and courage. And when dawn came, the light filtering through the trees felt like a reward, a gentle reminder that hope is never fully extinguished, no matter how deep the shadows. Over the years, the pioneers learned a delicate balance, to walk among the trees with respect, to work the land without demanding it, and to live fully even when solitude seemed endless. They discovered that the forest could be both challenge and sanctuary, both teacher and companion. Loneliness was tempered by purpose, fear was soothed by perseverance, and in every planted seed, every raised beam, and every hearth lit against the wind, hope quietly grew. Some evenings, when the wind fell silent and the sky burned pink and gold, families would gather on the small clearings they had carved from the wilderness. They would watch the horizon, imagining the generations yet to come, thinking of how far they had travelled, how much they had built. The trees around them were witnesses to this transformation, standing as quiet markers of struggle and triumph alike. Among them, loneliness was no longer a prison. It was a reminder of the strength required to dream and the courage required to act. And so, the forest became a home, not because it had been tamed, but because they had grown alongside it. Among trees stood loneliness and hope, coexisting like shadow and light, shaping every day, every choice, every future. For the pioneers, the wilderness was no longer empty. It was alive with possibility. Every tree whispered a story of endurance, and every clearing promised a tomorrow that they could shape with their own hands. In the silence between the trunks, one truth rang clear. Even in the deepest solitude, hope could thrive, and even in the wildest wilderness, human spirit could take root, strong, patient, and unyielding. As the seasons turned, the wilderness no longer felt endless or threatening. The forest had become a companion, and the cabins they built had become more than shelters. They were testaments to resilience, patience, and vision. The hum of work blended with forest songs, creating a symphony of life that spoke of survival, creativity, and hope. Mornings began with the rhythmic chopping of axes, the soft scrape of saws, and the steady murmur of conversation. Birds answered with their calls, leaves rustled in harmony with footsteps, and rivers whispered through the underbrush. Every action had a place in the orchestra, hammer striking nail, wood meeting wood, water flowing over stone, and every note celebrated the balance between human hands and the natural world that sustained them. Even the children became part of this rhythm. They carried bundles of firewood, ran errands for neighbours, or simply played in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Their laughter mingled with the wind, weaving human warmth into the forest's melodies. In those moments, work was not toil. It was a dance with the land itself. Every beam raised, every wall patched, every garden tilled was a note in the song of life taking root. The pioneers had learned a delicate art, to bend nature without breaking it, to shape it without dominating it. Trees felled for cabins were replaced with new saplings. Rivers were used wisely. Their banks tended to prevent erosion. Even their fires, which had once been survival tools, were now carefully managed, a symbol of harmony with the elements. The forest responded in kind, providing wood, game, and shelter, as if acknowledging their respect. The hum of labour became meditation, a steady heartbeat connecting generations. Neighbours worked together to build barns and fences, mend roofs, or carry heavy loads. The rhythm of their efforts was mirrored in the cycles of nature, planting, tending, harvesting, and resting. Even in the darkest winters, the forest offered a backdrop of continuity. And when the storms came, as they always did, their cabins held fast, singing a quiet song of resilience alongside the howling wind. Inside the cabins, the hum took a different form, the gentle chopping of vegetables, the stirring of stews over glowing hearths, the cracking of logs in the fire. These sounds, mundane yet profound, were the heartbeat of domestic life. Stories were told, lessons passed down, and laughter echoed where there had once been only silence. It was proof that human effort, no matter how small, could transform isolation into community. Over time, what had begun as scattered cabins in a vast wilderness grew into a network of homes, paths, and fields. Every settlement carried the memory of countless hands shaping the land, forging the rhythm that blended human song with nature's own. Each day's labour became a melody, each family a verse, each forest clearing a chorus of hope. Even as new tools arrived and technology changed the pace of work, the harmony of effort and nature remained. The pioneers' legacy lived not just in structures of wood and stone, but in the philosophy of life they left behind, that every stroke of labour, no matter how small, can resonate with the greater world, that human hands, guided by will and respect, can coexist with the wilderness, and that the hum of work can always find its place alongside the songs of the forest. When the sun dipped below the horizon, casting gold through the branches, the settlers paused. They listened. The forest murmured, the wind whispered, the creek sang, and beneath it all, the gentle rhythm of daily labour continued, a hum as old as time, blending with life itself. It was a symphony of endurance, of dreams realised, and of hope cultivated with every touch, every effort, every heartbeat. The pioneers had begun with nothing but will and a vision, and now, amidst the trees they had learned to honour and the homes they had built with care, they realised they were no longer mere survivors of the wilderness. They were composers of life, weaving human effort into the eternal song of the land. The hum of work blended with forest songs, a harmony that would endure for generations, echoing long after the first cabins had weathered storms, snow, and time. The nights were long and the winters harsher than words could convey. Snow blanketed the land in silence, winds howled through the skeletal trees, and darkness seemed to stretch endlessly between the cabins. Yet even in darkness, a small light remained, faint at first, flickering in the hearth, but steadfast enough to warm hearts and guide weary souls. That light was not just fire. It was hope. It was perseverance. It was the spark of human will that refused to be extinguished, no matter how wild the forest, how deep the snow, or how bitter the cold. Inside the cabins, families huddled together, sharing stories, dreams, and memories. A mother wrapped her child in fur, a father mended a tool for tomorrow, a neighbour dropped by with a loaf of bread or a piece of cured meat. These small acts of care became beacons in the dark, proof that life could endure and that even the most desolate nights were not without warmth. The pioneers learned to find light in unexpected places, a star shining through a frost-covered window, a candle flickering on a table, the glow of embers from a carefully tended fire. Each became a symbol of persistence. They knew that no matter how deep the night, every flame, every spark carried the promise of dawn. And they clung to that promise, not passively, but with deliberate courage. Work continued even in darkness. A bent tool was straightened, a frozen fence repaired, a handful of firewood split. These small tasks, performed in dim light, were not just chores, they were defiance against despair. Every action mattered. Every effort was a statement. We are still here. We endure. We will not be overcome. Loneliness, too, was tempered by that faint illumination. The forests were vast and quiet, but the settlers' hearts were not empty. They had each other, they had their families, they had the rhythm of daily life to guide them, and in that shared existence light multiplied, not in brightness, but in meaning. A whispered story, a shared laugh, a silent nod of encouragement, each moment added to the glow, making darkness bearable. Over time, that small light became a beacon for future generations. Children who grew up in the cabins learned that even in struggle, hope could survive. They carried that lesson into adulthood, that perseverance mattered more than ease, that effort mattered more than comfort, and that a single spark could illuminate even the bleakest night. The cabins, humble as they were, became symbols of endurance, each one a testament that the human spirit can shine regardless of circumstance. Nature, though often unforgiving, also lent its quiet encouragement. The moon reflected off snow, rivers glimmered under the starlight, and the soft rustle of trees whispered reassurance. The pioneers listened, they worked, and they dreamed. Even as storms raged, tools failed, and winters pressed harder than ever, they understood that light, however small, was enough to keep hope alive. It illuminated paths through the forest, hearts through hardship and hands through labour. It was the very essence of the frontier spirit: resilience, faith, and the courage to keep going when everything seemed impossible. By the time the first signs of spring arrived, that small light had multiplied. Cabins were repaired, crops planted, and smoke curled steadily from chimneys. The wilderness remained vast, but the pioneers' courage had turned it into a home. Even in darkness, they had built more than shelter. They had built a life that would endure, inspire, and remind all who came after, that no challenge, no matter how immense, could snuff out the human capacity to hope. And so, the frontier was never truly dark. For every cabin held a spark, every hand contributed warmth, and every heart carried a small but unyielding light, a light that would guide generations, long after the first pioneers had faded into history. Because in the end, no matter the storm, no matter the shadow, even in darkness, a small light remained. Before the pioneers arrived, the land was nothing but open wilderness. The ground was barren, dotted with rocks, tangled roots, and patches of stubborn soil that refused to yield. No cabins stood here, no fences marked the fields, no smoke rose into the endless sky. It was a world untouched, silent, and intimidating, a canvas waiting for human hands and a challenge waiting to be met. And yet, in the midst of that emptiness, a few determined families began to imagine something extraordinary. They came with little more than tools carved from stone, axes dulled by long travel, and the stubborn belief that they could make a home. It was not just ambition, it was necessity. They needed shelter to survive the coming winter, to protect themselves from the wind, rain, and wild creatures that roamed freely. But more than that, they needed to claim a small piece of the earth as their own, to build a foundation for life in a place where nothing had grown before. The first wall rose slowly, each log a labour of endurance. Felled trees were dragged across frozen earth, stripped of bark and trimmed to fit. Neighbours worked together, lifting, placing, and securing every beam with care. Without nails, without precise tools, without even knowledge of what they might face in the next storm, the pioneers shaped their first shelter. It wobbled. It groaned under its own weight. But somehow, it stood. That wall was more than timber. It was a testament to human courage and creativity. Every notch carved, every joint pressed, every rock laid to support the frame told a story of determination. For the first time, barren ground became sacred space. The echo of axes and hammers rang through the clearing like music, a rhythm of hope. People who had arrived with almost nothing now held something tangible, a home, however small and humble. Children watched wide-eyed as their parents transformed emptiness into shelter. They learned that walls were not just barriers against the elements, they were symbols of safety, patience, and vision. Even in that earlier stage, the miracle was clear. Humans could take raw, indifferent nature and shape it into something enduring. That first wall carried more than protection. It carried faith, ambition, and the promise of countless walls yet to rise. Nights were filled with awe and quiet reflection. The family would gather around the meagre hearth, warmed by the fire, listening to the wind whistling through the gaps. The wall shielded them, yes, but it also reminded them of the work still ahead. Every log meant more labour, every nailless joint demanded more skill, every crack whispered lessons about patience and perseverance. Over time, that first wall inspired more walls, more cabins, and eventually whole settlements. The miracle of that first structure became a legend among the settlers, a reminder that even barren ground could be made fertile with hands willing to labour, hearts willing to hope, and minds willing to imagine. It was proof that civilization could begin in the wild, that homes could rise from emptiness, and that the human spirit could leave its mark on the land, one log at a time. And so, the miracle of the first wall on barren ground was never just about survival. It was about possibility. It was about courage, determination, and the quiet but unstoppable power of people who refused to leave the wilderness unconquered. In that humble structure, a story began. A story of endurance, creation, and the very foundation of the life that would follow. After the first wall stood firm against wind and weather, A quiet realization swept through the settlers. The land demanded courage, patience, and heart more than strength alone. Their hands trembled as they cut, lifted, and secured each new beam. The logs were heavy, tools crude, and every misstep could cost hours, or even lives. Yet within that trembling was a steady rhythm, guided by hearts resolute and unwavering. Every cabin they raised required careful coordination. One hand might falter while holding a timber, another steadied it. A father's grasp, worn with toil, guided the hands of his son. A mother, bent over stitching hides or securing hearthstones, lent patience to younger arms. Though the body shook with fatigue, the heart held firm, infusing every motion with purpose. Fear was natural. Storms could topple walls, hungry animals prowled, and winters were merciless. Every sunrise brought the weight of uncertainty. Yet the settlers persevered. They knew that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. And in those trembling hands, steadiness was born. Hands that shook from exhaustion became instruments of creation. Hands that feared collapse became builders of home and hope. Children watched closely, learning the unspoken language of labour and care. They saw that even when hands faltered, hearts could guide them through. A misaligned beam could be corrected, a fallen log repositioned, a cracked hearth relaid. The process demanded patience, communication, and trust, not just in tools or timber, but in each other. Every action was a lesson. The human spirit could balance frailty with determination. Even small moments held profound significance. When a mother placed the final log atop a roof, sweat dripping into her eyes, she paused. Her hands shook from strain, but the heart behind them remained unwavering. That beam symbolized more than shelter. It represented the triumph of focus over fear, of unity over isolation, of resolve over despair. The settlers learned to measure effort with intention. Every nail hammered, every stone placed, every notch carved was deliberate. There was no room for recklessness. The forest demanded care. Yet within that carefulness there was beauty. Trembling hands shaping the land with quiet, steadfast hearts, slowly turning wilderness into home. By nightfall, when labour ceased and cabins glowed with candlelight, the settlers reflected on their day. The trembling of their hands had been replaced with pride. Every scar, blister, and aching muscle became a reminder that creation required both vulnerability and resolve. In that duality, trembling hands guided by steady hearts, the pioneers discovered the essence of endurance. Over time, the cabins multiplied, each one bearing evidence of human frailty balanced by courage. The forest no longer seemed daunting. It became a partner in their work. Even when storms battered roofs and winds bent trees, the lessons held firm. Hearts could steady hands, and purpose could turn fear into achievement. Generations would later look back on these early settlers and wonder how they accomplished so much with so little. But the answer was simple. It was not brute strength alone that built these homes. It was persistence, guided by care and courage channeled through trembling hands that refused to quit. Every cabin, every wall, every beam was a testament not just to labour, but to the human spirit, fragile yet unwavering. And so, as the first settlements took shape across the barren land, a quiet truth endured. It is not perfection that builds a home, but effort guided by heart. It is not unshakable hands that carry humanity forward, but hands that tremble yet follow the lead of steady hearts. Through this delicate balance, the wilderness was transformed into a foundation for life, for dreams, and for hope itself. In the vast wilderness, tools were crude, timber heavy, and winters merciless. Strength alone could not ensure survival. It was not muscle, but faith, quiet, persistent, and unwavering, that truly held the cabins together. More prayer than the power built those shelters. At dawn, before the chopping of axes began, settlers paused to offer thanks. To the land, to the sun, to a higher presence they hoped was watching over them. A whispered blessing before lifting a log, a silent hope as beams were aligned, a prayer of gratitude for warmth or sustenance. These small acts infused every action with meaning. Hands could move timber, carve notches, and build walls, but it was prayer that lent courage when fear and fatigue threatened to overwhelm. Every storm that rattled the roofs tested not only the strength of the cabins, but the resolve of those inside. It was easy to despair when wind tore through the forest or snow buried the fields. Yet settlers turned to ritual and reflection. A simple phrase, a quiet moment of thanks, a communal prayer over shared bread. These were more powerful than any hammer blow. The human spirit, fortified by faith, became a force stronger than timber or stone. Even children participated. A small hand pressed to a growing plant, a whispered wish beside a flickering candle, a gentle hope as logs were stacked, all gestures tied to faith and trust. Through these actions, the cabins became not just structures, but sacred spaces held together by care and devotion as much as by pegs and joints. Prayer guided every effort, transforming labour into ritual, hardship into purpose. Neighbours gathered to help one another, and often the work itself became a form of devotion. While lifting beams, hauling stones, or mending roofs, settlers sang hymns, recited blessings, or simply held a silent intention that their work would endure. The rhythm of labour and the cadence of prayer intertwined, creating a harmony that echoed through the forest, a living testament to human resilience guided by hope. Faith inspired ingenuity. When walls threatened to collapse, when resources ran low, it was trust in both God and one another that kept families moving forward. A prayer whispered before cutting timber became a moment of focus. A hope spoken aloud before planting a garden became a promise to nurture life. Through prayer, the impossible felt attainable. Through hope, labour became meaningful. Even after years of struggle, when cabins had grown into clusters of homes, settlers remembered the earliest days. The walls, strong as they were held together by more than nails and timber. They were held together by the whispered prayers of exhausted hands, the steady belief in tomorrow, and the invisible threads of faith connecting neighbour to neighbour. Each shelter, no matter how humble, became a sanctuary, not just from wind or snow, but from fear itself. Generations later, when these cabins had weathered storms and time, the settlers' descendants would tell stories not only of building, but of belief. They would recall how their ancestors relied on hope, patience and prayer to turn wilderness into home. Even in the hardest winters, even when work seemed endless, the strength of spirit, the quiet, unyielding faith, was more powerful than any tool or muscle. And so, the truth endured. It was not sheer power that built the frontier, but steady hands guided by heart, tempered by endurance, and lifted by faith. More prayer than power built those shelters, and through that faith, the pioneers carved not just homes but legacies, turning the wilderness into a world shaped by hope, courage, and devotion. Before nails, before hammers, before even saws, the pioneers had only the earth beneath their feet. Every brick was crafted by nature's hand, moulded from clay, hardened by sun, fired by fire, and shaped by human will. These humble materials were the backbone of every cabin, hearth, and chimney, a reminder that survival depended on partnership with the land. The settlers began by studying the earth itself. Clay-rich soil was dug from riverbanks, sifted of stones and roots, and mixed with water until it became pliable. Hands pressed the mud into simple moulds, shaped each brick with care, and left them to dry under the sun's relentless heat. It was laborious, repetitive, and exhausting work. Yet there was poetry in every motion. Nature provided the raw materials. Human hands gave them purpose and permanence. Even the fires used to harden the bricks were born of ingenuity. Wood gathered from felled trees fed the flames, smoke curling into the sky as the soft clay slowly turned firm. Each brick that emerged was more than a building block. It was a small triumph over uncertainty, a tangible measure of effort, patience, and harmony with the world around them. The pioneers relied on observation and trial. Too little sun, and the bricks remained soft and crumbled. Too much fire, and they cracked under heat. But over time, patterns emerged, and mastery grew. The earth itself became both teacher and partner, guiding hands to create sturdy, lasting walls. Even in the simplest structures there was art, bricks aligned with care, stacked with precision, forming homes that could weather storms, cold, and time. Every brick also carried a story. It bore the fingerprints of the labourer, the sweat of their brow, and the hope that each cabin could shelter family and future generations. Children learned early to respect this work, pressing clay, helping turn the bricks, watching as raw mud became solid walls. In those lessons, they discovered not just craftsmanship but connection to their parents, to the land, and to the life they were building together. Nature supplied more than clay. Stones for the hearth, sand for mortar, and wood for frames all came from the surrounding forest and riverbanks. Nothing was wasted. Every material was transformed, honoured, and integrated into the shelter. Even the smallest fragment, a pebble in the mortar or a shard of bark in insulation, reflected the resourcefulness and reverence of the pioneers. This reliance on the land instilled patience. Building a home brick by brick, log by log, demanded slow, deliberate effort. Each structure rose in rhythm with the seasons. Summer sun hardened the walls, autumn winds tested them, winter snow proved their resilience. Through this process, pioneers learned that lasting achievement could not be rushed. It had to grow, nurtured carefully by human hands and the generous bounty of nature. Over time, clusters of cabins emerged from the wilderness, walls gleaming in sunlight, bricks glowing red and gold, chimneys sending gentle smoke into the sky. Visitors and newcomers would marvel at these structures, not realizing that every brick was a labor of devotion, patience, and partnership with the world itself. What looked simple to the eye was, in truth, a masterpiece of human ingenuity guided by natural gifts. The lesson endured. Strength alone could not build a home. It required observation, understanding, patience, and above all, respect for the gifts of the earth. Every brick, every wall, every cabin testified to this delicate balance, that humans could shape their world, but only in harmony with nature's hand. And so, the frontier grew, not through force or conquest, but through hands guided by skill, hearts guided by hope, and bricks crafted by the enduring collaboration between humanity and the land. With walls standing firm and bricks hardened by sun and fire, the settlers turned their attention skyward. Shelters needed roofs, the final shield against rain, snow, and the relentless wind. But without sawmills, nails, or prefabricated materials, they had to rely on what the forest offered. Branches bent to become the roof's arms, rising from walls in graceful arcs, cradling the cabin beneath their wooden embrace. Each branch was chosen with care. Strong yet flexible, straight enough to span a beam but resilient enough to bend without breaking, the pioneers hunted the forest for timber that could serve a new purpose. They twisted and tied, propped and lashed, testing the curve until it held firm. It was artistry born of necessity, natural forms shaped to protect, support and shelter human life. The process demanded patience and intuition. A branch too brittle snapped under pressure. One too thick refused to bend, creating gaps that would let the rain inside. But through trial and error they learned the secret language of trees, how to bend without breaking, how to anchor without nails, how to build strength from flexibility. Every roof was a dialogue with the forest, a conversation in which humans listened carefully and responded with respect. Children watched these transformations with wide eyes. They learned that the forest could be both adversary and ally. A bent branch became a supportive beam, a fallen sapling transformed into a rafter, a twisted vine could hold it all together. Through observation and imitation, the next generation internalized the wisdom of bending, shaping, and trusting nature's guidance. Even small imperfections became part of the design. Knots in the wood, curves in the branches, and irregular shapes were not flaws. They were the signature of ingenuity. Pioneers adapted to these quirks, weaving them into the structure, turning challenges into solutions. The roofs, with their uneven beauty, became living testaments to human resourcefulness and respect for the wilderness. The roofs also carried symbolism. As they rose above the walls, they created a protective canopy, sheltering not just bodies, but hope itself. Under these arches, families slept safely, children played, and dreams were nurtured. Branches bent to serve human needs, yet they retained the life and history of the trees themselves. Every curve, every joint, every lash told a story of compromise, creativity, and harmony. Seasons tested the roofs relentlessly. Winter's snow pressed down, bending even the strongest timber. Rain tried to seep through gaps. Wind howled across the peaks, pushing and tugging at the structure. Yet the flexible branches absorbed the pressure, dispersing force in ways solid, rigid timber could not. The pioneers had unknowingly created a living design, one that worked with nature rather than against it. Even the act of construction became ritual. Neighbours came together to hoist branches, share knowledge, and ensure each roof would hold. Songs and laughter rose alongside hammer strikes and the creak of bending wood. Every cabin, every roof, became a monument not only to survival, but to collaboration, a dance of human ingenuity and natural wisdom. By the time the first fires glowed beneath the newly completed roofs, the settlers could look upward and feel pride. They had not only built a home, but had done so in harmony with the forest itself. Every branch that arched above them was proof of adaptation, patience, and the quiet power of working with what nature provided. And so each roof became more than protection. It was a bridge between wilderness and civilization, between survival and creativity. Branches bent to become the roof's arms, and in doing so the pioneers turned raw wood into shelter, labour into art, and wilderness into home. The cabins rose from the wilderness, modest in size, simple in design, and undeniably fragile. Walls could crack, roofs could leak, and storms threatened to undo months of labour in a single night. Yet within that fragile framework, something extraordinary held the settlers together. Love. Love for family, love for neighbours, love for the life they were creating. It became the hidden strength of every home. Each plank of wood, each bent branch, each sun-baked brick carried more than structural purpose. It carried intention, care, and devotion. Parents built not just to shelter their children from wind or rain, but to protect their laughter, their dreams, and their innocence. Spouses worked side by side, guiding each other through fatigue and frustration, sharing small smiles, whispered encouragements, and quiet moments of comfort. Love turned labour into ritual. Sweat and effort became meaningful acts, each nail hammered, each log lifted, each wall patched, a symbol of dedication. Even when cabins were small and materials scant, every corner, every hearth, every doorway reflected the human heart invested in its creation. Fragility mattered less than the courage and care poured into every gesture. Children learned the same lesson. When they pressed clay for bricks, hauled firewood, or tied branches into place, they saw their parents' patience and concern mirrored in every action. They understood that strength was not measured solely by force, but by persistence, attention, and love. Every crooked wall or imperfect roof became evidence not of weakness, but of the human spirit working to protect what mattered most. Neighbours, too, shared in this invisible scaffolding of affection. They brought extra hands during storms, shared food during shortages, and offered guidance when uncertainty loomed. Through these acts, the fragile homes became part of a broader network of care, sustained not only by timber and stone, but by compassion and trust. Even the wilderness itself seemed less menacing when communities worked together, hearts intertwined as surely as beams and braces. Storms came, as they always did. Snow-buried roofs, rain-battered walls, and wind pushed against every beam. Yet inside those fragile homes, warmth persisted. Fires glowed, families huddled close, and the simple act of being together transformed vulnerability into strength. Love filled the gaps that wood could not, reinforced corners that bricks alone could not hold, and protected hearts more securely than any roof. Even years later, long after cabins had weathered countless seasons, the memory of those early days remained vivid. Pioneers recalled how their children slept soundly despite leaking roofs, how neighbours laughed and sang together while mending walls, and how every meal shared carried more nourishment than food alone could provide. The fragility of the home was always evident, cracks, gaps, and imperfections, but love rendered those weaknesses inconsequential. It was the invisible mortar holding the settlement together. Ultimately, the lesson endured. Walls could be rebuilt, roofs could be reinforced, and storms could pass. But it was love that gave endurance its true power. A home's strength was measured not by timber thickness or brick density, but by the care, attention, and devotion invested within it. Fragile as the cabins might appear, they stood resilient, because human hearts had been their foundation from the start. And so, the wilderness that had once seemed indifferent bowed in a way to something far stronger than any storm. A fragile home, yes, but one where laughter echoed, hands worked in unison, and hearts beat together. In the end, Love made it strong, proving that even the simplest, most vulnerable shelters could become sanctuaries of endurance, hope, and warmth. The wilderness was more than an obstacle, it was a teacher. The settlers quickly realized that survival and success depended not only on strength or tools, but on observation and understanding. Learning from trees, understanding through water, they discovered that the land itself held lessons for those willing to listen. Every tree became a guide. Tall pines revealed the direction of prevailing winds, sturdy oaks offered timber strong enough for beams, and bent willows showed how flexibility could withstand pressure. By watching the patterns of growth, the settlers learned which branches could be used for roofs, which roots might trip an unwary foot, and which areas of forest were safest to clear for cabins or fields. Nature's architecture became a blueprint, teaching them rhythm, balance, and resilience. Rivers, streams, and even the smallest creeks were equally instructive. They provided not only water to drink, but lessons in patience and foresight. Settlers watched currents to understand which banks were safe to build near, which rocks could be stepping stones, and how to harness water to irrigate small gardens. Rainfall patterns dictated planting cycles, and seasonal floods warned of the land's hidden forces. By observing these elements, the pioneers adapted, aligning their efforts with nature rather than against it. The learning was often subtle. A branch snapped unexpectedly, teaching caution. A stream shifted overnight, teaching adaptability. No manual existed for these lessons, only experience, attention, and reflection. Every mistake became knowledge, and every observation became wisdom. Through these cycles, the pioneers began to understand the language of the wilderness. Children were active participants in this education. They followed elders to riverbanks, studied the shapes of trees, and helped plant gardens in carefully chosen spots. By engaging directly with the environment, they developed intuition and respect for the land, learning that nature could sustain life if treated with care and insight. Lessons were learned not just through labour, but through quiet observation, watching leaves bend, water flow, and soil yield under hands that understood its patterns. Even construction reflected this learning. Logs were selected based on the natural curve of branches. Cabins were oriented to shield from winter winds and catch summer sun. Gardens were planted along the contours of the land. Every choice demonstrated a harmony between human needs and natural design. By learning from trees and understanding through water, settlers built homes that were both resilient and in tune with their surroundings. This connection also fostered patience. Nature moved at its own pace. Trees grew slowly. Rivers carved their paths gradually. Settlers could not rush the seasons, and they learned to pace their work accordingly. They discovered that haste led to mistakes, but careful observation and timing led to enduring success. By aligning effort with natural rhythms, human labour became more effective and sustainable. Over time, these lessons rippled through the community. Knowledge of safe paths, strong timber, fertile soil, and predictable water sources was shared among neighbours, strengthening the settlement. The wilderness that once seemed untamed became a source of guidance, a repository of wisdom, and a partner in shaping life on the frontier. Ultimately, the pioneers understood a profound truth. Strength alone could build walls, and courage alone could raise roofs, but wisdom, learned from trees and water alike, allowed life to thrive. Observation and understanding became the foundation of every home, every field, and every garden. Through nature's teachings, settlers discovered that human effort, when combined with attention and respect, could create not just shelter, but a sustainable, harmonious life. And so, amidst towering trees and flowing streams, the pioneers flourished. They listened, they adapted, and they grew alongside the wilderness. Learning from trees, understanding through water, they transformed challenges into guidance, raw materials into shelter, and wilderness into a home. The wilderness was neither enemy nor friend. It simply existed, with its own rules and rhythms. The pioneers quickly understood that survival depended on respecting these rules, working with the land rather than attempting to dominate it. Building life upon the laws of the land meant observing, adapting, and aligning human effort with nature's unyielding order. Fields were sown along natural contours, following the gentle slopes of the soil and avoiding flood-prone lowlands. Water was channeled carefully to nourish crops without eroding precious earth. Cabins were positioned to shelter from prevailing winds, capture sunlight, and remain close to streams or wells. Every decision reflected an understanding that nature's patterns, when honoured, could sustain life. Ignore them, and survival became a daily struggle. Embrace them, and prosperity followed. Animals taught additional lessons. Tracking deer or observing the habits of birds revealed seasonal changes, hidden dangers, and fertile grounds. Settlers learned to predict frost, rainfall, and wildlife behaviour, integrating this knowledge into daily life. Even hunting and gathering became exercises in balance, taking only what was needed, leaving enough to ensure future abundance. The pioneers also observed the cycles of growth, decay, and renewal. Trees were felled sparingly with saplings planted to replace them. Soil was enriched with ash, compost, and natural fertilizers, ensuring the land remained productive. Nothing was wasted. Every remnant of human activity returned to the ecosystem in some way. Life was built not by conquest, but by cooperation with the natural world. Communities too reflected these laws. Paths were laid according to terrain, homes spaced to avoid overcrowding, and labour divided according to skill and strength. The settlement was an ecosystem unto itself, mirroring the balance observed in the forest and fields. Every action was intentional, every structure a response to the environment rather than an imposition upon it. Children were taught these principles from an early age. They learned that a garden planted too early might fail, that a poorly chosen site for a cabin could flood, and that understanding the seasons was essential to survival. Through observation and participation, they internalized the wisdom of the land, ensuring that the lessons of one generation guided the next. Even in times of hardship, the settlers found reassurance in these patterns. Drought, storms, and harsh winters were challenging, but the pioneers knew that by following nature's laws, they could mitigate risks and plan for recovery. This knowledge transformed fear into preparation, uncertainty into strategy, and labour into sustainable growth. Over time, life on the frontier became a harmonious dance with the land. Every field cultivated, every cabin built, every stream harnessed reflected understanding, respect, and patience. The pioneers learned that lasting success required more than effort. It required insight, attentiveness, and reverence for the forces beyond human control. Ultimately, building life upon the laws of the land meant creating structures and communities that could endure. It meant acknowledging that human effort was strongest when guided by wisdom, not just by strength or will. It meant accepting that life was interwoven with natural rhythms, and that harmony with the environment was the foundation of all survival. By honouring these laws, the pioneers transformed barren wilderness into thriving settlements. They built homes that could withstand storms, fields that could sustain families, and communities that could flourish for generations. In doing so, they demonstrated a timeless truth. Civilization is most enduring when it grows in concert with the world around it. And so, amidst forests, rivers, and open fields, human life took root. Every cabin, every garden, every pathway reflected a careful balance between necessity and respect, labour and observation. The settlers had learned the forest's secrets, listened to the land's wisdom, and built a life upon its immutable laws. Before cabins could rise tall, before dreams could soar beyond the forest, the pioneers understood one simple truth. Every life begins at ground level. To touch the sky, they first embraced the soil, planting, tending, and nurturing the earth that would sustain them. Fields were tilled by hand, often with crude tools, scraping stubborn soil into readiness. Seeds were sown carefully, rows spaced for sunlight and water, each kernel a promise for the future. The earth was harsh, heavy, and unyielding, but the pioneers knew that patience and persistence could transform it. Every handful of soil turned over was an act of faith, an embrace of life, and a step towards sustenance and stability. Water, too, became both teacher and ally. Streams and rain nourished the crops, and the settlers observed its patterns to maximize yield. They learned which areas retained moisture, which slopes drained well, and how to prevent erosion. Through these lessons, they discovered that thriving life requires respect for the land's natural rhythms, and that ambition without understanding often led to failure. Even the act of composting, returning plant remnants to the earth, was a lesson in humility and foresight. The pioneers understood that the soil gave life only if it was treated with care. They cultivated more than crops. They cultivated patience, discipline, and an intimate understanding of cause and effect. It was this connection to the earth that allowed them to reach higher, build stronger and dream further. Children played, learned, and worked alongside their elders. They dug small furrows, planted seeds, and watched patiently for sprouts to break through the soil. Through this hands-on experience, they absorbed lessons that could not be taught with words alone. That growth takes time, that persistence is rewarded, and that true accomplishment begins with humble effort. Even cabins and community structures were influenced by this grounding. Foundations were dug carefully, walls built on solid ground, gardens planted near water sources, and paths laid with consideration for natural slopes. The settlers had learned that before one could aspire to touch the sky, to build tall homes, secure futures, or create flourishing communities, they had to master the basics, embrace the soil, and honour the earth that sustained them. The soil also became a teacher of resilience. Droughts tested their patience, floods challenged their ingenuity, and frozen ground demanded extraordinary effort. Yet every difficulty strengthened their bond with the land. Through trial and error, observation, and adaptation, the pioneers discovered the cycles that allowed life to endure and flourish. Over time, their efforts bore fruit, literally and metaphorically. Crops grew, fields expanded, and homes became secure and permanent. But more importantly, the settlers gained confidence, wisdom, and connection to the land. Every beam raised, every seed planted, every garden tended was rooted in the understanding that reaching higher required first grounding themselves in the fundamentals of survival and care. Ultimately, the pioneers' journey from soil to sky became a symbol of human endeavour. Their hands in the dirt, their backs bent over fields, and their eyes observing nature's subtle lessons allowed them to rise above mere survival. The cabins, the gardens, the thriving communities were all proof that greatness grows from humble beginnings, and that the earth beneath our feet is always the first step toward reaching for the heavens. And so, amidst the forests and open fields, the settlers flourished. They built homes, cultivated life, and created legacies, all because they first embraced the soil. From the ground up they learned, persevered, and ultimately touched the sky. The wind howled across open fields, snow lashed against cabin walls, rain drummed relentlessly on fragile roofs, and the forest seemed to whisper of challenges yet to come. Yet inside those modest shelters, life endured. Soft dreams beneath harsh weather gave families strength to face each day, reminding them that hope could flourish even when the elements conspired against them. Each night, after long hours of labour, settlers gathered around small hearths. The fire's glow illuminated tired faces, casting shadows across walls built by weary hands. Children nestled close to their parents, wrapped in furs and blankets, their breathing slow and even. Outside, storms raged. Inside, hearts whispered courage. Soft dreams were not indulgent escapes. They were lifelines, tender reminders of purpose, love, and resilience. The pioneers had learned that endurance was as much about spirit as it was about shelter. Cabins could crack under wind, roofs could sag beneath snow, and rivers could flood the land. But even the harshest weather could not touch the warmth of a family gathered together, nor the quiet hope that tomorrow might bring calmer skies. Dreams were the invisible walls reinforcing every physical structure. Parents shared stories of past struggles and victories, weaving lessons of courage and patience into bedtime tales. Children, lulled by voice and warmth, absorbed not just the narrative, but the reassurance that even hardship could be met and overcome. These nightly rituals turned fragile cabins into sanctuaries, transforming fear into confidence and hardship into preparation. Outside, the forest and fields waited with challenges anew. Cold mornings demanded endurance, muddy trails tested resolve, blizzards and storms pressed relentlessly. Yet each sunrise reminded settlers that life continued, that effort mattered, and that perseverance turned dreams into reality. Soft dreams beneath harsh weather became the quiet engine propelling them forward, a promise that resilience was possible, even in the face of relentless struggle. Neighbours leaned on one another during the fiercest storms. A shared roof, a helping hand, or the warmth of a communal fire reinforced the truth that human connection could shelter hearts as effectively as logs and mud-sheltered bodies. Every meal shared, every log replaced, every wall patched strengthened the fabric of both community and family. Together, dreams and labour intertwined, providing hope against adversity. Even the smallest successes, a seed sprouting, a roof secured, a stream diverted, became symbols of endurance. The pioneers celebrated these victories quietly, internalizing the lesson that life, like weather, ebbed and flowed, and that patience and perseverance were essential. Each act of care, each moment of preparation, fed the soft dreams that buoyed their spirits. Over time, these small, persistent hopes accumulated. What began as fragile cabins and timid aspirations grew into thriving homesteads and confident communities. Storms still came, snow still fell, and wind still howled. But the settlers had learned to endure, not merely through strength, but through heart, through hope, and through dreams nurtured beneath harsh skies. Ultimately, soft dreams beneath harsh weather were more than protection. They were the soul of frontier life. They reminded pioneers why they endured, why they laboured, and why they built. The cabins, fields, and families that survived were testimony not only to physical effort, but to the enduring power of hope and imagination. And so, beneath rain, snow, and wind, life persisted. Fires glowed, stories were told, and children dreamed. The harshest elements could not extinguish the tender aspirations that guided every action, every labour, every decision. Soft dreams beneath harsh weather carried them forward, lighting the path from survival to life, from hardship to home, and from wilderness to legacy. The wilderness stretched endlessly, a tapestry of bare fields, tangled underbrush, and distant hills. At first glance, it seemed desolate, inhospitable, even hopeless. Yet within these empty meadows, pioneers discovered the seeds of possibility. Hope rose quietly, like the first morning light spilling over frost-kissed grass, guiding hands, hearts, and minds toward life and growth. Each clearing became a canvas. Settlers mapped cabins, planted gardens, and marked paths, turning open land into places of purpose. Every furrowed row of soil, every newly built fence, every log laid for a cabin was infused with intention and vision. The empty meadows were no longer voids. They were stages for human ingenuity, perseverance, and aspiration. Even the smallest signs of life inspired courage. A sprouting seedling, a grazing deer, or the distant song of a bird reminded settlers that the land could sustain them if treated with care. Hope, once faint and fragile, grew stronger with each small victory. The barren terrain began to hum with possibility, whispering that effort, patience, and faith could transform it. Communities blossomed alongside the fields. Neighbours shared knowledge about soil, water, and crops, teaching one another the rhythms of planting and harvesting. Cohesion replaced isolation, laughter punctuated labour, and cooperation multiplied the chances of success. Empty meadows became hubs of life, vitality, and shared dreams, proof that hope could flourish where despair once lingered. Children learned to read the land. They followed streams, watched the growth of young saplings, and helped cultivate gardens, absorbing lessons of observation, patience, and diligence. Through their eyes, the meadows transformed from intimidating wilderness to a living classroom, full of wonder, discovery, and potential. Hope was not abstract. It was tangible, cultivated with care and nurtured by daily labour. The seasons tested their resolve. Droughts, floods, and storms pressed relentlessly, threatening crops and structures alike. Yet with each challenge, the settlers' determination deepened. Empty meadows, once symbols of scarcity, became landscapes of resilience. Every setback was met with renewed effort. Every barren stretch eventually bore fruit. Even at night, hope endured. Campfires glowed, casting light across open fields, while families and neighbours whispered dreams into the darkness. Stars above mirrored their aspirations, distant yet constant, and every meadow, however empty, became a place where imagination and courage could take root. Over time, barren fields transformed into thriving homesteads, orchards, and gardens. Huts became cabins, cabins became communities, and empty meadows became the foundation for generations. Hope rising in these once empty spaces proved that life could emerge even where none seemed possible, and that human endeavour could turn isolation into opportunity. Ultimately, the pioneers' work revealed a timeless truth. The emptiest landscapes carry the greatest potential. Where others saw desolation, they saw a stage for growth. Where others saw nothing, they saw everything: life, community, and the promise of the future. And so, in the heart of open meadows, the pioneers' dreams soared. Hope rose steadily, infusing every log, every seed, and every effort with possibility. Through vision, perseverance, and faith, empty meadows became living, breathing proof that even in the most barren places, hope could take root and flourish. As the frontier slowly transformed from wilderness into settlement, each home stood as more than timber, stone, or mud. Each home was a promise, a vow to endure, to protect, and to believe that tomorrow could hold more than today. It was the culmination of labour, faith, and hope, where effort met purpose and hardship was tempered by vision. The pioneers understood the fragility of life on the edge. Storms could flatten walls, frost could ruin crops, and sickness could strike without warning. Yet in each modest cabin, a quiet optimism persisted. Families woke each morning knowing that their homes offered more than shelter. They were sanctuaries of possibility, places where dreams could grow despite uncertainty. Every home reflected personal sacrifice. Parents laboured from dawn until dusk, hands blistered and backs bent, building not just walls but futures. Children slept safely inside, learning the rhythm of life through the stories, songs, and lessons shared within those walls. The fire at the hearth was a daily reminder. Warmth, security, and perseverance could coexist even in a harsh world. Neighbours, too, played a vital role in this promise. Communities formed organically, each household reinforcing the next. Together, settlers shared tools, labour, and wisdom, ensuring that every cabin was more than an isolated structure. It was part of a collective network of survival, encouragement, and hope. The sight of a newly completed home rising from the earth became a symbol that life, though difficult, was worth building, sustaining, and protecting. Even the simplest routines carried significance. Chopping firewood, mending roofs, tending gardens, or baking bread were acts infused with intention. Every task completed reinforced the belief that effort today planted the seeds for a better tomorrow. Walls became more than protection. They were tangible reminders that human perseverance could triumph over adversity. Children, especially, absorbed the promise embedded in their homes. Every log, brick, and branch told a story, that the work of previous generations safeguarded their future. Through this, the next generation inherited not just shelter, but a legacy of resilience, patience, and hope. Each home was a living testament that the hardships endured today were building foundations for brighter days. Nature continued to challenge them. Storms battered roofs, floods threatened fields, and harsh winters tested resolve. Yet the promise of each home endured. Cabins, though humble and sometimes fragile, became symbols that human effort and determination could withstand even the fiercest trials. The very act of rebuilding, repairing, and maintaining reinforced the belief that life could improve with persistence and care. Over time, clusters of homes grew into communities, cabins evolved into villages, fields expanded into orchards, and meadows transformed into spaces of productivity and life. Through it all, the underlying promise remained unchanged. Tomorrow will be better. Every sunrise brought a chance to reinforce that commitment, to nurture hope, and to continue building a future worthy of effort and dreams. Ultimately, the pioneer's message was timeless. A home is never merely a shelter, it is a vessel of possibility. It embodies faith in human ingenuity, love for family and community, and the enduring belief that hardship is temporary, and perseverance is rewarded. Each home, no matter how small or humble, carried this promise, a whisper that through labour, patience, and hope, life could flourish. And so, in the quiet corners of the frontier, as fires flickered behind wooden walls and smoke curled into the sky, the settlers rested with assurance. Each home was a sanctuary, a commitment, and a beacon of optimism. No matter the storm outside, each wall, each roof, each hearth carried the message forward. Tomorrow will be better. And so, we have wandered together through forests and meadows, across cabins raised with hands, hearts, and hope. We have touched the rhythm of quiet labour, felt the weight of timber and clay, and watched as dreams rose from soil and stone. Every wall, every beam, every humble home whispered stories of patience, courage, and care. Wherever you are now, May your night be just as still as theirs once was. May your thoughts settle like snow on a quiet field, and your heart find warmth as steady as a candle, glowing through the night. Thank you, dear listener, for joining me on this journey, for sharing these moments of wonder and reflection. If you wish to, linger here with us, and perhaps subscribe softly, only if it feels right. Let us carry these tales with gentle footsteps into the quiet of your evening. Now the stars rise slowly, the fire flickers low, and the forest sighs under a blanket of night. Rest easy, dream softly, and remember, the echoes of those first homes still hold a quiet, enduring light. Good night.